All right, welcome here, everyone. We'll pray and then we'll introduce what's going to happen today and then get into some stuff. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together as your people to deal with what is a simple and complex issue all at the same time. And I pray that you would give to us both knowledge and wisdom as we progress throughout today. Help us to understand what is going on in our world and the things that we need to do in response as Christians so that your name may be glorified and that your kingdom may be expanded. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so Iris was going around with these nice little booklets. They're available there on the back if you didn't get one. Essentially what it is it's just a printing out of the slides that you'll see, and then just a little bit of room there for you to take any notes if you want. You'll also notice in the back, we will talk about some of this stuff a little bit, but I've compiled Appendix 1, a glossary of transgender terms from various sources, and we'll go through that a little bit. One of the toughest things to do whenever you get into any sort of sociological or philosophical discussion is before it even starts, you have a tendency to pass in the night because you're using the terms. It's that Inigo Montoya, Princess Bride, brilliant wisdom. You know, you're using that word, but I don't think that you know what it means, right? Or whatever he says. And then the second appendix, we'll go through a little bit of that too later on. Just select resources for further study. So if you don't have one, or if you want another one at some point for people that are going to maybe watch this at some point, you can feel free to take one. On the bulletin board in the back, just to let you know kind of how the day is going to go, there's a schedule posted on the bulletin, but basically we'll go till, somewhere between 10 and 10:30, take a 15-minute break for coffee, and then from whenever we get back after that 15 minutes till noon, then we'll have our second topic, biblical theology of sex and gender. Then we'll break for lunch, and then we'll have a response offered, then take a break, and then a Q&A time. You'll notice in the back that I have some Q&A stuff that I sort of trying to anticipate questions, put a few of them down. So there's stuff there. So if you have questions throughout, if we get through maybe one of the sessions a little bit earlier, maybe we'll have some time for questions, but essentially what we need to do is put this all together, and maybe some of your questions will get answered at some point as we move on. So that's why we're leaving the questions until the very end. So if you have questions, jot them down. We'll ask them at the end. We're all friends here. Like I said, when you come to a new issue like this, if you have a question, chances are somebody else has that same question. So feel free to ask away, and then we're done, or I'll say it this way: I'll be done answering questions when the questions are done. So I'm going to be back here tomorrow morning, so I might as well just stay up here till then. So whatever, it's all good. So this morning, for the next little while, we're going to talk a little bit about transgender ideology. I just want to. I read this somewhere, and I thought it's a good statement for anybody doing a presentation like that. It was a pastor or I don't remember. So I milk a lot of cows, but I make my own cheese. With that, what he meant by that is that I've done a lot of reading and research on this, and I can't possibly cite all my sources. So just know that a lot of this stuff is going to be coming from other people. I'll try and make mention of that as much as I can. But if it doesn't make sense, or if it is too complex or whatever, it's probably not me, it's somebody else. So as we move through, let's make sure that we are understanding that I didn't just come up with this stuff. So, all right, 2011, the title of this thing came from this song, unfortunately. Lady Gaga, 2011, wrote the song Born This Way, and it encapsulates really our situation and where we're at, and the problems that it arises. So this is somewhere in the middle of the song. No matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgender life, I'm on the right track, baby. I was born to survive. No matter black, white, or beige, cola or Orient made, I'm on the right track, baby. I was born to be brave. I'm beautiful in my own way because God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. Don't hide yourself in regret. Just love yourself and you're set. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. Now, I have no idea where that song ended up on the charts, and I have no idea if the song was any popular or anything like that. But it does encapsulate the situation in where we are. I'm on the right track. No matter who I am, no matter how I identify, no matter what my situation is, no matter where I came from or am going to, I'm on the right track. And then, obviously, the mention of God there by Lady Gaga is somewhat ironic, but it does speak to a lot of the ways that people think. I'm beautiful because I'm made that way. And whether they invoke God or whether they invoke something or somebody else, that is the basic idea. I am not a mistake. No matter what I like or do, no matter how I feel or think, there's nothing about me that is a mistake. And so, again, this is 11 years ago, and this is not philosophy, but it is culture. It is pop culture, which gives you an indication of how far into our culture this kind of thinking has come. For many of us, our first introduction to the transgender issue was in 2015 when Caitlyn Jenner burst on the scene. She was on 2020, and then she was on the cover of Vanity Fair as a woman. No longer, she said, was she Bruce Jenner. She was now Caitlyn Jenner. One thing you'll notice about that picture is how she's standing. Notice what she is trying to tuck between her legs. Again, the idea that she is a woman, but still, in a large way, a man. And then, to great, or some, not great, controversy, Glamour magazine named her Woman of the Year in 2015, which, again, led to the sort of public discussions, which has come out in a lot of ways recently about exactly what is a woman. What is a woman specifically, and what is a man? And the reason why the question is asked, what is a woman, is because typically people who change genders are men that go to female, not the other way around. An overwhelming majority of transgender transitions are from male to female rather than the other way around for various reasons that we will explore somewhat later. Then we have this person, and I'm gonna commit a transgender sin, and maybe a sin against you too. I don't know. I'll combine dead naming, which is the naming of a person according to their previous identity, which is abhorrent to transgenders, combined with using their transgender names and pronouns. So this is Laverne Cox. She became well known for her role in Orange is the New Black, and she received an Emmy for her role in another TV program called Doubt. And if you pay attention to this sort of thing, she even got her own transgender Barbie. We all know about some others like this. If you know Chaz Bono, Cher and Sonny Bono, daughter, who is now a male. And then you also know about cross-dressers like RuPaul and who hosts the show Drag Race, which is entirely about transgenders and stuff like that. Then we had this situation just a little while ago. Supreme Court Justice, at this point she was a nominee, she was asked if she could define the word woman. Simple question. She said, I can't, not in this context. I'm not a biologist. And that answer became somewhat celebrated, good for her for not coming up with the answer to it, as a lawyer. And then others obviously criticized her and saying, well, where the heck are we in the world, in North America, in the US, in justice if we can't define a simple question like that? Then we have issues in sport. This is Leah Thomas. She was a UPenn swimmer who essentially dominated her sport. She competed primarily in the 500-meter freestyle. And as a male swimmer, she was average, below. After her transition, she became dominant, to say the least. And there are lots of other stories like this, stories of track athletes, stuff like that, who are average or below average in their sport, who transition and then become dominant in their sport. There's also stories, and again, we'll touch on these a little bit later on, that include high school sports. There was an issue a few years ago, wrestling. I believe it was in Colorado. A man transitioned to a woman and just beat the crap out of everybody in the state championships. And then we have Hannah Mountsie. Hannah Mountsie is a rugby player in Australia who weighs in at 225 pounds and stands 6'2". And she was recently banned from competing in international rugby and competing for the Australian national women's team. Again, transgender activists got all bent out of shape over it due to bias and transphobia and all the rest. But if you want to see some very interesting pictures, just look up Hannah Mountsie and you'll see her competing and stiff-arming and running over and jumping on some of her female compatriots. Then we have this individual, an immensely popular YouTube channel. It's been a show on the Learning Channel for a little while. It's actually been in its 7th season now. And the show follows Jazz Jennings, who is now a teenager. She was born a boy but transitioned to becoming a girl. And what's interesting about her case is that she started her transition at 4 years old when her parents sought to get her diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So she is, again, now, I forget her exact age, but late teens, I believe. And her YouTube channel documented all of this kind of stuff, and the show kind of follows her around. And then we've got other characters as well. Just most recently, Ellen Page, now Elliot Page, made her transition with much fanfare on December the 1st, 2022. And if maybe some of you have watched it, an entire film was made by Matt Walsh, a Daily Wire correspondent, seeking to engage people on exactly this question. So the issue has been thrust massively into our... Why am I not getting any slides? All right. Well, you have them in your notes. We'll figure that one out later on. We are in a significant cultural moment in North America and in Europe when long-standing beliefs and practices about sex and gender have been challenged and questioned by Christians and non-Christians alike. And there are several places you can go online for a quote-unquote Christian defense. There's a group of Catholics, for example, that have a web page dedicated to transgender rights. There are several works by quote-unquote evangelical Christians, one of which we'll just briefly touch on later on. But the mainstream has approved these revolutionary changes that I think we could all agree, and I'm only turning 50 shortly, they would have been unimaginable 20, 30 years ago. And yet we have to admit that these things are happening. As Douglas Murray says there, quoted in their PowerPoint, there's no issue, let alone one affecting relatively few people, that has so swiftly reached the stage whereby whole pages of newspapers are devoted to its latest developments, and where it is a never-ending demand not just to change the language, but to make up the science around it. Ideas once considered radical and extreme are now deemed to be just normal. They permeate our social consciousness. They're all around us, even taking the form of public policy. Now, we've had a few years ago massive battles over bathrooms, for example. We have third gender or many gender category options on things like birth certificates and driver's license. Massive battle. If you know who Jordan Peterson is, several years ago, a massive battle at his university over whether gender neutral or gender specific pronouns other than he and she should be used or forced upon others. Then there's the question of access to publicly financed hormonal and surgical interventions for gender transitioning. Here in Canada, that's a bigger deal than the US due to our public medicine. My wife works at the hospital. She works in the pharmacy area. And there are, not a lot, but there are a number of people who get transitioning medications for free from the government. It's considered a human right, and so they get that kind of treatment for nothing, and it's not cheap. And then, to top it all off, we're kind of at the very sort of center of this is the demand by many to affirm multiple gender identities because it's a human right. Obviously, then, we have issues in health and education, social services, trying to figure out what they do with the claims of persons who have transitioned. We've got issues in public policy. What do you do with women's shelters? What do you do with women's prisons? What do you do with men who have been convicted of sex crimes or violent crimes of some kind that have now changed their sex and are then placed in women's prisons? How then do you work on women's safety, child safety, when you have a male that has transitioned? What are they? Is that a man that has transitioned, or is it now a woman? And what do you do with it? And so the idea of gender identity specifically is a break from the conventional assumptions that sex differences are fixed and normative. So it's not just, you don't just sex an animal anymore or sex a human. You don't just look, for lack of a better way of saying, between the legs of a child when it's born and say, boy, girl. Now you talk about sex assigned at birth, and we'll talk about what that means later on. Essentially, we are now in a clash of worldviews. On the one hand, we have the mainstream narrative on transgender rights, transgender ideology. This is basically how it works. In the past, people took for granted that gender and sexuality were simple matters. You were either born a man or born a woman, and that was the end of it. You lived accordingly throughout your life. But now we know better. We understand that gender and sexuality are more complex than previous generations understood. There's a difference between biological sex, birth sex, and gender identity. There's a difference between sex and gender. Some people have a gender identity other than their biological sex, and thus we have cases of a man born in a woman's body or a woman born in a man's body. In fact, gender identity is itself complex. It's not just as simple as I'm a man born in a woman's body or a woman born in a man's body, because gender is a continuum. It's not just binary. In other words, there's not just two options, there are multiple options. So some are they're just more than male, more than female, and vice versa. And on the flip side of that, some people are neither male nor female. They don't identify with either genders, which is why we need so many new terms like genderqueer, gender fluid, et cetera, et cetera. And so amidst all this complexity and fluidity, there's one central axiom. Gender identity reflects a person's true identity. Your gender identity is who you are. It expresses who you really are. Consequently, they should be able to express that gender as they see fit without fear of judgment or disapproval or discrimination. So it's a basic human right for a person to live according to their gender identity because their gender identity is who they are. This means that gender identity trumps everything else. Biological sex, physiology, birth certificate, etc., etc., etc. And if a person is unhappy with their biological sex, their physiology, they have the right to pursue whatever means available to them to correct it. What's more, everyone else must respect and support their right to do so. So that's the one side of it. On the other side of it, you have the biblical worldview, which is rooted in some very, very different things. And we'll explain what this means later. It's rooted in ontology. It's rooted in the fact that essence precedes existence. We are not existentialists as Christians. Essence precedes existence, not the other way around. We have a worldview rooted in teleology, in purpose, telos, in an end. Things are going somewhere. And obviously within ethics that are much, much different. And the biblical worldview seems to contradict the worldview I just described in just about every way possible. So these kinds of changes did not occur in a vacuum. They reflect cultural, philosophical, and political developments whose origins go much further back than just a few decades. We can't think that just because we first learned about transgenderism when Caitlyn Jenner showed up, that it hasn't been around for a long time. It has been around for a while. The other issue we need to recognize is that transgenderism is not rooted in the normal things that we would think give us absolutes, like science. They rest on assumptions about the nature of the world, how we know what is true, and how we live and act. So in other words, if I can use the terms I just used, their transgender ideology makes claims about ontology, the nature of things, about telos, the purpose of things, and therefore about ethics. How do you deal with right and wrong and good and bad? And so we cannot escape the questions of worldview. So here are the kinds of things that we're going to seek to answer today. How did we get to this place? In our social imaginary, and I will explain what that terminology means in a little bit. In our culture. I don't necessarily like the word culture because I don't think it explains whatever. That's a different discussion for a different day. What is transgender ideology? How can, as we've asked already, such a small group exert so much influence on our society? And then how do we respond? How do we respond? So how do we get here? How do we get here? Well, ideologies have a history. I apologize for this not working. I'm not sure why we're not getting these PowerPoint slides showing up. They're there, I promise you. See, they were there. Whatever, I'll work on it at the break. In the West, basically in the last 200 to 300 years, a notion of the way we conceive ourselves as human beings, as human persons, has come to dominate the popular culture. Dramatic changes we see in society are given coherence or unity by things that have happened in the past, things that have built. And so what we could do, which would be incredibly boring and not exactly accurate, is we could go thinker to thinker in this quest to trace transgender ideology, but that is a fool's errand. And the reason why is because of the terminology that I used, social imaginary. Our culture is more than just built on the thinkers of the past. Okay? So, clear example, you've heard of Sigmund Freud, right? Any of you read any Sigmund Freud? No. Have you heard of Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Have you read any Rousseau? You've heard of Immanuel Kant? Read any Kant? René Descartes? Read any Descartes? Have you heard of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault? Yeah, nobody's read any. And yet the influence of those men, monumental for where we're at. Okay, monumental. So I could take you through what Jean-Jacques Rousseau said. I could take you through what Sigmund Freud said. And you would be like, oh, I can see that connection. But our culture is more than just built upon thought, which is why I use the term social imaginary. It's not my term. It's the term of a Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor explains the social imaginary as being the combination of factors, the way we think in our culture, the way we imagine our culture to be, and the way we act within our culture. So, for example, and I'm just not going to get distracted, I promised myself, if I were to ask you, if I were to just take all of you aside and ask you one simple question, describe for me the Canadian cultural context, I would get 50 different responses. Some of you would be incredibly negative, right? Some of you would go straight to Justin Trudeau and just be irate. Others of you wouldn't mention him at all. You'd mention music, or you'd mention movies, or you'd mention something else, right? So we all imagine our culture to be different, which means what? We act differently towards our culture, right? So we all think about our culture at some level, but that's not typically how we engage with our culture. We imagine it to be a certain way, and then we act upon what we think it is. And what we think it is might not actually be the way it is, which is why it's difficult for us to have cultural conversations, right? Because you think a certain thing about culture, I think it's so different. We both have a different social imaginary. And so one of the ways, essentially what we're saying is that cultures are not the pure product of rational thinking, right? None of us, one of the examples that Carl Trueman uses, and we'll be basing a lot of what we're about to talk to you on Carl Trueman, is he says, if I come across somebody getting beat up in the street, I don't automatically I don't reflect on Kantian ethics. I don't reflect on my biblical worldview. I just act. And my act reveals what my social imaginary is, what I feel about my responsibility to my brother, my neighbor. So if I walk past, that reveals how I view my culture, how I view the social imaginary. If I interject, then that reveals that, right? So I never actually think about it, even though what I'm doing in my culture, doing with my culture, is somewhat thought through, which means that we all intuitively relate to our culture, and we all, this is one of the things we have to admit later on for the criticism to stand, participate in where things are right now. So we may disagree with our culture, but we have to be honest with ourselves about how we, in our culture, in our social imaginary, the way we think and act, how we have affirmed our culture, okay? And it's not just simply like, well, I'm going to vote for a different political candidate, or I'm going to this. That's not that simple. Politics doesn't change much when it comes to social imaginary, right? So we have to think in more detailed terms than that, okay? So there's no better commentator, I think, at the moment than my former professor of church history at Westminster, Carl Trueman. He wrote a couple of books that are just brilliant books. I highly recommend, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you want to kind of know where we're at, pick up Strange New World by Carl Trueman in order to understand kind of where we got here. It's a short little book. It'll introduce you to a whole bunch of stuff, and it will necessitate at least 4 or 5 reads, I assume, because you're going to come across guys you never. And if you're really brave, stupid, have a lot of time, whatever, read his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's bigger, longer, more detailed. Wouldn't recommend you start there, but Strange New World is the place. And you're going to hear him as I move along into these topics of how we got here. So one of the ways that Truman and other sociologists, is not his terminology, have described where we are is with the terminology of expressive idealism. Expressive idealism. Again, terminology used by Charles Taylor and his book Secular Age talks about the psychological categories and inward focus which have become the hallmark of the modern person. Charles Taylor points out that, quoting him, the sexual revolution was moved by a complex of moral ideas in which discovering one's authentic identity and demanding that it be recognized was connected to the goal of equality. So everyone gets to write their own script. And as a result of that, it is wrong to tell someone that his or her choices or beliefs are wrong or immoral. So the way we think about ourselves in our current society, the normative notion of ourself is one where our inner feelings about ourselves are critical to our identity. They're critical to who we are. And our culture tells us that the only way you can live a meaningful life, an authentic life, is a life that is solely focused on expressing your belief about yourself. So it's not just about believing the things about yourself, it's about expressing those beliefs. And if you don't do that, if you're not honest with yourself about who you are and express that, you will never find fulfillment. And you will be harming yourself. You will be harming yourself. So Truman uses a good example. I like this example, so I was trying to put it in my terms, but his example is beautiful. And I think many of us can relate to it. Okay? He used the example of how his grandfather and himself would have expressed their feelings about their job. So Truman is a professor, right? He's highly educated, brilliant. Just as an aside, I remember taking church history class from him. He walks in the room, no notes, right? Just walks in the room, sits down, jeans, shirt, right? Sits down, throws his feet up on the table in front of him and goes, "What class is this?" It's this class. "And what did we talk about last time?" We were talking about so and so. He's like, "Okay." Then you kind of think a little bit, and then boom, he's off. Hour and a half, just boom, just straight from his head, just teaching us church history. He didn't have a clue what class he was in. And then when he finds out, it's kind of like the Matrix, right? I need the software program for a Black Hawk helicopter, right? And the bank, there it came. Brilliant. By the way, highly recommend his podcast, Wages of Spin. If you've never listened to it, you should listen to it if you're into podcasts. Anyway, so this is the example he used. His grandfather was a factory man in the Midlands of England. He is a post-secondary teacher, highly educated, PhD, teaches for his life. So the very idea of job satisfaction, he says, would have been a completely alien concept to him. So as I'm thinking about this, think about your grandfather, your great-grandfather, whatever it is, right? But if we would have asked him, if we would explain to our grandfather, do you find your work worthwhile? Do you like your job? Do you find satisfaction in your job? Truman says, I think my grandfather's answer would have been something like this. Yeah, I find my work worthwhile because I get paid a fair day's wage for an honest day's work. I'm able to put shoes on my children's feet, bread, meat, and potatoes on the table. In other words, what he's saying is that I go to work so I can feed my family, I have obligations, and so I work for those obligations. Now, if you would have asked Carl Truman, do you get job satisfaction? He says, I'm intuitively going to respond in a somewhat different way. I'm likely to respond this, yeah, I find teaching young people great. I love it when I'm in class and there's some back and forth when I'm trying to explain a complicated idea and I see light bulbs go on and in students' eyes something happens and they've understood something that's not clear to them. Notice the differences between the two answers, right? The grandfather's answer is connected to obligations. I have a role to fill, and I go to work to fill that role, right? The relationships of obligations he has to other people drives him. Truman's answer, he says, is grounded in psychological satisfaction. I go to work so that I can be satisfied. I get a special feeling from the work I do because of the success of my teaching. And so the simple reality is that Truman, even though he's writing a book contrary to this, recognizes that he is as much immersed in expressive individualism as anyone else. It's my inner core feelings that are most important thing about me. Grandfather, not so much. How he felt about his work didn't matter because his satisfaction was connected to external obligations. So his grandfather, he says, was who he was because he had a relationship of responsibility towards others. I am who I am because I feel a certain way about myself, right? So now you can see where we've come as a culture. So put it in the context of transgender ideology, this means that in enhancing the freedom to establish one's identity extends not only to my choices regarding sexual practices and partners, but to who I identify with, or who I identify as, male, female, somebody else. Okay, when somebody says I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, that would have been regarded as nonsense 40, 50 years ago. But now it's commonly accepted. Why? Because we've moved our identity internally. Okay? And this internal realization, this movement has caused political and social orthodoxy to change. So I'm a woman trapped in a man's body prioritizes inner feelings, and the ability to express those inner feelings outwardly means that I am now an authentic person. So here's the thing. If human sexuality exists solely for our self-actualization, so here's one of the movements. Sex is no longer something I do, it's who I am. Massive change. So my sexuality is not what I do, it's who I am. I am actualized as that. And then the satisfaction that I find as a person is my ability to express that externally. So it makes no sense then, politically, socially, legally, whatever you want to say, to put restrictions on something as arbitrary as gender. Because you are now violating me, not what I do. See the difference? Okay? So in the face of such claims, appeals to religion, appeals to biology, appeals to science, anything like that just don't make any difference. So here's where we've come. Here's where we've come. So I'm going to use some terminology. Again, doesn't come from me, and it's fancy, and you can... I wish I had my PowerPoint slides because I don't think I have it in here. We have moved from what's called a mimetic to a poietic society. Mimesis means that the world has an order to which we must submit. So nature has an order that creates a framework, right? And we have to submit. Nature tells us how we respond, and then we respond accordingly. Poiesis tells me that the world is raw material, and I'm free to manipulate it to make my own reality. So we've moved from a mimetic to a poietic culture. And we've done that because feelings and desires have become more important than bodies. Okay, so for example, 100 years ago, okay, imagine, somebody, your grandfather, well, maybe like your grandfather's biggest rival, okay, in 1915 going to his doctor and saying, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. What would that doctor have said to him? His doctor would have said, well, that's a problem, and we need to get you psychological evaluation. We're sending you to Selkirk. We're sending you to an evaluative port. It's a problem with your mind. Your mind is wrong. Because the doctor is operating in a world in which the body dictates to the mind. The body tells the mind what it actually is. But now it's different. Okay, it's different. You go to a doctor now and say that. The doctor is operating in a world in which the mind tells the body what to do. Because the body is raw material. It can be manipulated however you want. And that is essentially expressive individualism coming full circle. And so then, when we think of the descriptors, lesbian, gay, bisexual, straight, etc., they become decisive for identity. So the whole story then is to trace kind of how we got to expressive individualism. How did we get here? So very briefly, I say that all the time and it's never brief. Here we are, we're still on slide 13. The inward turn. The inward turn. Again, these terminologies and a lot of this information is coming from Truman. If you were living in the Middle Ages and said who you are, your answer to that would have been external. Who are you? I am the son of so-and-so. I am a peasant. I am a blacksmith. I live in such and such a place, right? I am Jared of Steinbach, right? That's how you would have identified yourself, right? But now that your sense of self would have come from the relationships around you, from the external realities around you, which emphasizes your place in society, your responsibilities. But now that's reversed, and we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau as one of our major thinkers, and the Romantics, not the band, the group of philosophers, to thank for that. Now, again, this is one of the reasons why I got to listen to Wages of Spin, because Carl Truman said this about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he's right. Not that he needs my affirmation. He says, if I was in a room and I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in there with Hitler and Rousseau, I'd shoot Rousseau twice. Rousseau is declared this: man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Okay, that's, if you remember anything about Rousseau, that's what you got to remember. Born free, but everywhere in chains. Now, what does he mean by that? He means simply this. Well, simply, okay? He argues that culture messes people up. Society messes people up. That we're born in a relatively pristine state, we're born relatively free, and it's as we enter into society and form relationships with other people that we become corrupted. We start performing in ways that are accepted by society. And then we become envious and jealous with each other, we start to compete, and then what do? We start to suppress our feelings in order to function well in society. And once we do that, we become less than human. We become less than human. So what Rousseau's thinking then spawns is this romantic movement. First an artistic movement, but as well as a philosophical movement. And there's a whole bunch of people in Scotland and England and elsewhere who believe in this stuff. But it was a movement that placed great emphasis upon the inner feelings, and the inner space is defining who I really am. Feelings become constitutive of all authenticity. And society, broadly considered, is always a first and foremost threat to my authenticity. I can't be who I am because society tells me that I can't be that way, right? So one of the examples that Truman uses, that he uses kind of as a foil, is why is homosexual behavior accepted in society but foot fetishes aren't? Right? So homosexuality is accepted, but foot fetishes, which are, in my opinion, kind of creepy, but if it's your thing, whatever. Keep it between you and your wife, knock yourself out. But foot fetishes are not considered to be mainstream. If you were to declare, walk into your job and say, hey, I'm homosexual, people would be like, oh, good for you, good for coming out. If you'd walk, I take pictures of my wife's feet. They would be, okay. Right, we're going to stay away from that guy, right? So why is that? Why is that? Rousseau is part of the explanation of that, because our culture tells us what is acceptable and what isn't. And when it does that and overstates its bounds in certain ways, then we get into the threat to personal freedom. So the self, with Rousseau and Romantics, becomes what we can call psychologized. Psychologized? I can't speak. Psychologized. It becomes internal. The psychological self. We can borrow terms, I think, from Philip Reef, if I remember correctly. The self becomes my inner psychological space, how I think about myself. So when Rousseau says man is born free and everywhere in chains, what he's saying is that all the relationships around me have the potential to bind who I am, okay? And so we have to free ourselves from those chains. Now, it's no wonder then, just so that you can continue to think poorly of Rousseau, Rousseau had 5 children, sent them all off to orphanages after they were born. Why? Because, to his credit, he lived out his philosophy. I cannot be bound by the external relationships of my children. Now, in the 18th century, when Rousseau lived, that was a death sentence for these kids. I don't know what happened to them, but children were restrictions on his freedom. He's a philosopher. He's active in his world, and they infringe on his ability to be himself. So he gets rid of them. So the inward turn. Second thing is you have to sexualize the inward turn, and this is where Sigmund Freud comes along. The modern pursuit of human autonomy, freed from all constraints to create one's own identity, is one of the radical strands of the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution undermined traditional understandings of sex and gender and paved the way for individual choice. We have Sigmund Freud to thank for sexualizing the previous inward turn. So, few things. Nobody believes anything that Sigmund Freud said about sexuality, right? Like, his theories have long been debunked, but that's not the influence of Sigmund Freud. The influence of Sigmund Freud is that he turned psychoanalysis sexual. He was influenced by the Romantics, and he was very interested in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but where Rousseau sees that inner space as a psychological self and pristine, Freud doesn't see it that way, right? Rousseau thinks that the human being is unspoiled and, for example, wouldn't need law. He just intuitively knows what the right thing is to do, and society messes that morality up, okay? But for Freud, he sees that inner space not as a happy place, but as a dark and destructive place. Freud sees it as sinister, filled by odd, sometimes violent sexual desires. But Freud goes further back than adults. He goes back into childhood. In his 3 essays on sexuality, he articulates human development, how it works out. And every stage in human development, from infancy into the grave, is defined by sexual relationships. So with Rousseau, we've turned ourselves inside. With Freud, we've sexualized that inside. So what he's doing is he's making sexual desire the part of our core being, who we are. So again, his theories of how that worked, mom envy, dad envy, all that kind of stuff, that's gone. But the sexualizing of the inner self remains. Now, when you've moved your identity inside and you've sexualized that, the next thing you do, the next thing that needs to be done is you got to politicize the sexual self. So once sex has been turned into identity, it's inevitable that sex is going to become highly political. Because if you think about it, at the heart of most societies are moral codes, a set of restrictions on sexual activities, right? You're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. You can look from society to society. They're not always the same, but all societies have sexual boundaries within them. Every civilization has rules. Now, once sex becomes your identity, then those rules are transformed not simply into restrictions on behavior, but into restrictions on who you are, your identity. They become personal. So the laws effectively define who is a legitimate person and who is not a legitimate person. Notice, it's not what is a legitimate act, it's who's a legitimate person. So once sex becomes identity, it is inevitably going to become politicized. So now we can understand why such a small group, a little bit, can influence our society, our culture, and politics. A significant movement for transgender rights is afoot. That's not shocking, and these rights are understood to conflict with all sorts of beliefs that our society has held, but we have to push for transgender rights because it is a human right. A couple of other things we need to understand as being influential here. The sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is one of these things where we typically think about the sexual revolution as this time in which The nature and function of sex is transformed, and its acceptance is expanded. Promiscuity and pornography and homosexual sex and all the rest, we're now more open to it. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Because it is a statement about the, not just acceptance, but about the moral turn of things. So, under the old regime, sexual acts had an intrinsic moral quality to them. Some sex was legitimate, it was moral. Some considered immoral. So when you think about it, right, you have sex with your spouse, legitimate, 50, 100 years ago. Sex with somebody else's spouse, not legitimate, right? But now it's different. It's different. It's not an issue of immorality now, okay? It's an issue of consent. So the issue is not, is having sex with that person right or wrong? It's, is that person willing to participate or not? That is what's immoral. The sexual revolution has simply done that. It has made every sexual activity open as long as you are consensual about it. Okay, so it hasn't simply expanded the amount of sexual activities one you can engage in, it's changed the very nature and significance of sexual activity. Okay, so there's a couple of other things we need to mention. Postmodernism. Hate that word necessarily, but here's how it applies. Because underpinning or along with all the rest of this stuff is what Pluckrose and Lindsay call in their book Cynical Theories, applied postmodernism. Critical theory, critical race theory is applied postmodernism, which essentially has done this, right? Objectivity is essentially impossible. Logic and reason are not ideals to be driven for, but attempts to shore up privilege, right? So reason, syllogisms, logic, that is typically white power, which is seeking to maintain itself. Equality is no longer achieved by replacing unjust laws and practices with new ones, but by giving everyone a chance to define their own identities and to live out and thrive with those identities. Being a man, woman, non-binary, gender fluid, whatever, becomes a matter of defining your own identity and revealing it to the world. So since nothing is objective, you can be whoever you want, and nobody can criticize you. The second other thing we need to consider is technology. Let's say it this way. Without the printing press, the Reformation doesn't happen. Without technology and science, the sexual revolution doesn't happen. Because two things in particular were massively important in the sexual revolution. The ability for women to have sex and not get pregnant because of the birth control pill, and abortion becoming more mainstream and more readily available, which meant that now not only could men be promiscuous, but women could too, and they both could do it without consequence. So technology made that available, right? But think about it even more. Technology has transformed the nature of physical reality, of the authority of physical reality. We now live in an era where I can change what I don't like about myself, right? If I think I'm fat, I can go and get defat surgery. What do you call that? Liposuction. Defatting surgery. I can go get liposuction. I don't like my nose, I can get a nose job, right? I don't like my crow's feet, I can get a facelift. I can go get Botox injected into my face, right? I can do all sorts of things to change myself. And if I don't like my gender, we'll talk about this later, I can change that too, right? So without technology, that's not an option. That doesn't even touch on the prevalence of technology in influencing what's called clustering, which we'll talk about later. But there we are. So this is why I like to talk about social imaginary culture. Like we got here for a reason. And so what we have to understand about all of this stuff, and again, I'm going to not get distracted here, is that let's say it in an insulting way, and you can just take it for what it's worth. I love Christians who think that things are so simple when they're not. You know, we need a new prime minister. What's that going to do? Yeah, you can think whatever you want about Justin Trudeau, but you think another prime minister is actually going to do any, like he may have better policies in certain ways, but nothing's going to change. Our culture is going to be the same. There's going to be no new abortion laws. There's going to be no new homosexual laws. There's going to be no new, nothing's going to change. Why? Because our world is a complex of ideas, imagination, and actions, right? Our culture is intuitively known and responded to. And often, and I won't get into this one, there's lots of books you can read about it, often our politics is simply a reflection of where our society is at. Politics don't influence society. Politics simply reflect it, right? More often than not, right? Unless you want a dictatorship, right? Then you get a little bit of a different situation. But these issues are complex. There's no one easy answer. What do I do with blank? Well, as we've seen, this stuff comes out in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places, and there's some are arguments, some are not. And one of the things you'll be frustrated with, I hope, is you're going to see throughout our argumentation that it's almost impossible to argue with someone who believes in transgender ideology. So what time have we got? I'm already massively behind. I was telling Tanya, I was like, you feeling comfortable? I was like, I don't know if I have enough information for an entire day. And she burst out laughing. He's like, you never shut up. He's like, you have plenty of information. Anyway, so we're going to be, no pun intended, fluid with what we talk about. We'll get through all of our stuff, but we'll be somewhat fluid. So let me just give you the argument. The argument. So now we are, I don't know where we are. We're 14. See? Look at that. I've been yakking on. We're only on 14. So the argument. Here's the thing we need to understand. No one makes a clear argument for transgenderism. Don't even bother looking for it. It's just assumed today that gender and sex are different. In fact, to demand an argument is considered to be violent. It's considered to be hate speech against a transgender person. To ask them to defend who they are is offensive. A lot of transgender activists, to the chagrin of black activists, will say, asking me to defend why I am a woman trapped in a man's body is equivalent to asking a black person why he is black. It's offensive. You don't ask a black person that. You don't ask me that. So it's considered a defeater belief in our culture to suggest that sex and gender are connected. And most of the presentations of transgenderism are based on stories and history, and all of them have critical theory at their basis. So Helen Joyce, in her book Trans, not a Christian author, but a good book, she kind of offers 4 general things that she's noticed about transgender arguments as she's kind of moved around, and I've sort of taken that as a framework and realized that I've massively adapted them. But that's where this whole thing started. So I'm going to give you 4 ways in which transgender arguments, and I use the word arguments loosely, kind of move forward. One is, again, you can hear critical theory pop itself out here. The very notion of binary sex is an artifact of Western colonialism and thus oppressive. It's oppression. Okay? Transgender history is usually obsessed with dealing with how past cultures and other cultures thought beyond binary sex. So if you go to Wikipedia, for example, and look up transgender history, what you're going to find is just a laundry list of other cultures in present or past that apparently didn't think in terms of binary sex, male, female, right? That's the history of transgenderism, is just this review, right? And inherent within this is the assumption that racism is inherent in claiming that the rest of the world needed white Europeans to explain to other people how binary sex, or how sex was binary and how reproduction worked, okay? And this argument that sex is not binary typically extends to pseudoscience. So you're asked to assume that gender is a spectrum. Here's how it typically goes. Let me just read this from an article entitled, "Why All the Anti-Trans Arguments Are Bogus." So this is how a trans person will argue. Every single trait Okay, I want you to, I'm going to test how smart you are. I want you to see where the logical fallacy happens and where the jump occurs. I won't look at you, so here's it's an extended quotation, but it indicates to you kind of where this thing is. Okay? And this is by a PhD biologist. Okay? A transgender, I believe her name is Julia Cerrone or Cerrone. She's a PhD biologist, now a trans activist. This is what she writes. Molecular biologist, so she really should know her stuff. Every single trait is a complex trait, which means that a trait has many, many different inputs. Some of them are biological, but some may be environmental. And there's also a lot of random chance in biology. And all that stuff comes together to create a spectrum of outcomes. So take height, for example. Height is a really good example because we all understand it. If you look at height, there's not a male height or a female height, right? Even though it is sexually dimorphic trait, you get these bell curves. What she means by sexually dimorphic is that typically men are taller than women, right? But there are some tall women and there are some tall men biologically, right? There are, even though it's sexually dimorphic trait, you get these bell curves. There are these factors that go into it. There are over 100 genes that are known to have at least some impact on height. So you get these overlapping bell curves, such that even though there is a biological component like gender differences in height, we wouldn't be surprised if we were to see a tall woman standing next to a shorter man. We see that every day. So there can be sex differences at the same time that they're complex traits. And so there's a lot of overlapping bell curves. If you just apply that, not only to every single physical trait between the sexes, but also if you take into consideration gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation. These are all concepts that trans people did not invent. Did you see the turn? What did she do? She went from biology to psychology, right? She said there's bell curves in biology, which you can see. You can chart. There's 100 genes. You can take a look at that. And she said because there's bell curves in biology, a spectrum of heights among women, a spectrum of heights among men, as an example, there is also, she said, if you take into consideration gender identity, which is how you feel about yourself, and expression, how you express that identity, and sexual orientation, who I'm attracted to, these are all concepts that trans people didn't invent. So she's leapt from biology to psychology. That is called a non sequitur. There's no connection between that. Or let's say it this way. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. You have to demonstrate a connection between, for lack of a better way of saying it, mind and brain. Okay? The brain is the mush, the stuff that looks like macaroni. The mind is your thoughts, your character, your personality, right? What Scripture partly calls your soul. Okay? So that is the kind of argumentation that goes on. The very notion of binary sex is a Western colonial activity which is designed to oppress people. And that is, if I'm honest, the best scientific argument you will get right there, which is a massive leap. So that coherent? There you go. Yeah. It's so coherent, it's identifiably idiotic. So that's number one. Second, sex, not gender, or sex, not only gender, is socially constructed. So the argument is, again, a lot anecdotal, right? So again, the transgender history page on Wikipedia goes through all this laundry list of people groups that are both male and women and everything in between. And then you get statements like this, okay? Again, from that same doctor. When we're talking about men and women, we're often talking as much about language as we're talking about features of the real world. We're talking about labels. We're talking about categories. We're talking about terms that we decide to use. We're not having a debate in which some people accept biology and other people reject biology. I think it's really helpful to think about it this way. In other words, sex and gender are not defined by biology, they're defined by the labels that we use. So Judith Butler is most famous for attempting to make this argument philosophically. She claims that sex and gender are not distinct things and that they're socially constructed. So here's what she does. Two things that typically happens in this kind of argument. The first one is that you have to deconstruct the meaning of the words sex and gender. You have to destroy their meaning. She believes that transness happens when there's a mismatch between a social act imposed on an individual and that individual's self-knowledge. So, for example, when you were born, what the doctor did was the physical equivalent of the sorting hat in Harry Potter. Seen Harry Potter, read the books, right? The sorting hat goes on. Sorting hat is like, Gryffindor, and you're all excited, right? Slytherin, crap, I'm going to be evil now, right? And that's what the doctor does. Looks, boy, right? It could have been Gryffindor, it could have been Slytherin, but he chose Hufflepuff or whatever, right? So that's what happens. So that is why trans activists don't typically use the word sex. They use the word biological sex, or they like to use the term sex assigned at birth, assigned sex. So the first thing you got to do is you got to destroy what we mean by those things and turn them into a social construct. The next thing that you have to do is you have to do what's called reifying. You have to reify. You have to make it concrete. Okay? So you have to take a concept and make it concrete. That means you're turning. The main argument is that what happens with people is that there's different ways in which trans people think that is connected somewhat maybe to their brains. And because of that, we have to legitimize their feeling and their identity regarding who they are. Okay? So the first thing you do is you say sex and gender are social categories. The second thing you say is that however the trans person feels about themselves is concrete. It's reality. We have to accept it as such. And the results of that are simply this. This comes from the Human Rights Campaign website regarding trans children and youth. Here's what ends up happening, right? And we'll talk about this more later. Children then are not born knowing what it means to be a boy or a girl. Now we have to understand, we'll get into definitions a little bit later, but gender we say it this way. Sex is male, female, gender is masculine, feminine. It's how I act based upon my gender or my sex, okay? So children are not born knowing what it means to be a boy or girl. They learn it from their parents, older children, others around them. The learning process begins early. As soon as a doctor or healthcare provider, notice the word they use, declares based upon observing the newborn's external sex organs, it's a boy or it's a girl, the world around that child begins to teach it lessons. So in other words, the doctor declares something, you are a boy, based only upon what is hanging or not between the legs. And then the parents and everybody around them, what do? You dress the boy in blue, you dress the girl in pink, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the boy or girl begins to learn what it means to be masculine or feminine. But the problem lies, says this website, gender doesn't simply exist in these binary terms. It's more of a spectrum. Right? So there's more than just masculine and feminine. There's all sorts of degrees in between. And transgender people identify along this spectrum. And they identify as a gender that is different than the one they were assigned at birth. So again, the whole idea that gender and sex are social constructions. They're just labels. Right? So argument number one is that the notion of binary sex is Western colonial oppression. The second thing is that sex and gender are socially constructed. They're not biological. Okay? So those are the first two arguments. Now the third one is the tendency in discussions for someone to eventually bring up clownfish or other animals. Now if you know anything about clownfish, that's Nemo. This is often called the Nemo argument, which I find kind of funny. But the Nemo argument goes like this. Okay? Clownfish are what's called sequential hermaphrodites. Okay? They're born with the potential to mature into either males or females. And when the dominant female in a group, in a school, dies, the largest, most virulent male is going to switch his sex. He's going to become the female. He's going to become fertile and then continue the breeding patterns for that species, for that particular group. And so the argument goes, since clownfish can change their sex, and there are many other creatures, both bacteria and et cetera, that can do this. Since they can change their sex, there can be no objective distinction between male and female. But here's the problem. They're clownfish. Okay? Now, I don't know how much you remember about biology, but the simple reality is that clownfish aren't mammals. And there is no mammal anywhere in the world that does this. Mammals are of one sex or the other, and that sex is immutable and determined at conception. That is what is true for mammals. Okay, so even if you're an evolutionary biologist, you're going to have a problem with that. So that's the third thing. It tends to bring up clownfish or something else. The fourth thing is the claim that people with intersex conditions prove that sex is not binary. So, for example, we will talk about this later, is that by intersex conditions, we're talking about people who have diseases of sexual disorder. So you might have heard the term, and this would be offensive, hermaphrodite, people who are born with both genitalia. So they might be born with external male genitalia but have ovum tucked up in between, or they might have been born with a vestigial penis, or they might have been born with a vagina and the testicles are stuck in, right? That's the simplest example. There's all sorts of diseases of sexual disorder, okay, which create intersex. Is it male? Is it female? We're not really sure because it's not clear, right? And so that is often cited as hey, if people can be born like this, that shows us that that sex is not binary, that there are middle categories. Just for the record, if you want to know, between roughly about 1% of all human births suffer from a disease of sexual dysfunction. However, as we'll talk about later, these are the exceptions that prove the rule. So now we can see it all coming together. If the individual is primarily a matter of inner feelings and desires, then everything that imposes upon how I feel about myself becomes oppressive. Historical narratives, scientific narratives, philosophical narratives, or, in our case, religious narratives that don't affirm me become oppressive. They become narratives of oppression. Okay? These things become something that presses down on me and prevents me from becoming myself. And when that explodes in the public square, it becomes a need to change everything, right? Including our history. We have to remove the signs and the symbols of that alleged oppression. We have to remove laws. We have to change policies. We have to take male and female off of bathrooms and just put whatever on there. All things in our society have to be altered or removed because their very existence is a witness against my self-identity. And so everything pivots to the victim. It makes me a victim. Okay, we live in a victim culture. We know that, right? And I'm a victim because when culture makes me try and be something that I am not. When expressive individual emerges as a force, everything pivots to the individual. Okay, it's why I mentioned dead naming before. It's why dead naming is so offensive. Why? Because it reminds me of a history that was not who I am. Right? So we've heard of a number of celebrities get into trouble for calling Caitlyn Jenner Bruce Jenner. Because when he became a she, that history, that's not who he was. Or to say it better, transgender activists would say Bruce Jenner was always a woman. He only recognized it when he made his transition. So to call him Bruce Jenner, even referring to his Olympic gold medals and all of his, he was what, a heptathlete or something like that, or octathlete or a decathlete or whatever he was, right? Caitlyn Jenner won the gold medal because that's who he always was, right? Queer scholar Lucas Crawford. Lucas Crawford says this: by insisting on the primacy of the present, by seeking to erase the past, or even by emotionally locating their real self in the future, that elusive place where access and social viability tend to appear more abundant. In other words, Usually it's incredibly painful for a transgender person to look at the past before their transition because it's filled with all sorts of oppression. And so you can't dead name them. And it's why traditional freedoms like speech and religion are now under huge pressure. Once the self pivots inward, once expressive individualism emerges as the most significant force, then suddenly how I think about myself is the way you need to think about me. Because if you think differently about me, you're offending me, you're hurting me, you're taking away my rights. Words become violence. Words become oppressive. Because to use a word about me that denies my identity is to contradict who I am. That's why transgenderism it sets itself within human rights. In a world of expressive individuals, words have nuclear power. And that is why some of the most powerful and contested debates in our society tend to focus on linguistics. How do we refer to people? What words do we use about them? That's why people can lose their jobs by not referring to a transgender person as she or he if they ask it, or they or them or z or z or z, whatever, right? Because you are contradicting their identity. It would be the equivalent of using the N-word or worse. A lot of transgender people will say it's worse than using the N-word against a black person, right? You're not going to walk into your office and refer to a black person by the N-word. So why would you walk into my office and refer to me as a he if I'm a she? Right? It's offensive to me. All right, just you got 10 minutes? Let's take a break at 10:30. Just a brief. Let me talk about a brief history. Just this brief history of individuals who are important here. So now we're going to move. Four main individuals. John Money. In the 1960s, he was a sex researcher and psychologist who spent his career at Johns Hopkins University. He's generally credited with popularizing the use of the term gender. He wrote, "I need a term that did not exist to explain what people were doing when they took on roles and identity of sex different from their biology." So he used the word gender. He came up with the terms gender identity, gender role, sexual orientation, and introduced them to the psychological world. Robert Stoller, he wrote a significant book called Sex and Gender, the Development of Masculinity and Femininity. He uses the term sex to refer to male and female, the biological parts, and used gender in the way that Money desired to use it as well. And so he argued that most people are classified by an algebraic sum of the qualities that go into making a male and female. And he says those qualities include chromosomes and genitalia and hormonal states and secondary sexual characteristics, but also stuff going on in your brain. So he says brain systems influence who you are sexually. By the 1970s, psychologists had begun to consistently use the word sex and gender to differentiate between biological characteristics, sex, and non-physical components of sex that are regarded to be appropriate for males and females. Two significant people at this time were Harry Benjamin and Magnus Hirschfeld. Harry Benjamin has been called the father of transsexualism. He was an endocrinologist born in Germany but lived in New York for most of his life. His book, he wrote a book in the late 1960s, I think, called The Transsexual Phenomenon. It was the first work of its kind describing and explaining an affirmative path of treatment for people who are battling with transsexualism. He believed that trans people suffered from a medical rather than a psychological condition, so we don't send them off to get mentally evaluated. We deal with their physical condition. And so he was at odds with a great many psychiatrists of his day. Most psychiatrists of his day would diagnose trans people with being delusional or having schizophrenia or something like that. And he said, no, we need to treat them physically. His most famous patient was Christine Jorgensen, who we'll talk about a little bit later. Magnus Hirschfeld was also a German. He was a doctor and a sexologist. He worked closely with Benjamin. His paradigm presented gender as existing on a continuum between male and female. He once estimated that there were over 43 million possible combinations of sexual characteristics, and he thought that that number was actually too small. He coined the terms transvestite and transsexual, distinguishing between the two. Transsexualism, again, these are older terms, so you don't have to necessarily remember them, is the adoption of a gender role opposite of a person's birth sex. Transvestites were people that wanted to cross-dress in clothes of another gender, but still wanted to be men. So they're men, but they like to cross-dress from time to time. Hirschfeld initiated changes in thinking that prepared the way for modern transgenderism. Again, at the time, transsexuals were considered to be basically a branch of homosexuals. So you have homosexuals, and in that homosexual, you had lesbians, and then you had femmes and butches, and then you had men over here, you had femmes and whatever, and then you had transvestites, right? That were kind of off of homosexuality. He said, no, that's an independent third category, which is why we have lesbian, gay, trans, LGT. Well, it's BT, but whatever. And the physicians at his clinic attempted the first genital surgeries to reassign a person's sex. Two of the first attempts at gender reassignment surgery happened in the 1920s and the 1930s at his institute. Two early important figures are Christine Jorgensen and David Reimer. Christine Jorgensen was he was born George, a native of the Bronx, a U.S. Army veteran. Between 1951 and 1952, Jorgensen had gender reassignment surgeries in Denmark because you couldn't do it here. They just weren't available. On December 1st, 1952, the New York Daily News and many other newspapers on the East Coast had the headline, "Ex-GI becomes blonde beauty. Operations transform Bronx youth." And you can go back and you can look at newspaper headlines from 1951. And essentially, the significance of Christine Jorgensen was that she introduced North America to transgenderism, to this kind of person as just a normal. And since it was a U.S. Marine, or a U.S. veteran, 1950, not that far away from World War II, so you can't exactly say that, oh, it's a femme guy. Right? It's just a gay man. It's like, no, this guy shot some guns, and he was in the army, so this is a man's man, and now he's a woman. So what do we do with that, right? The second most significant person is David Reimer. Coincidentally or not, born in Winnipeg, or Kleefeld, or somewhere here in the southern states. He has a book written called "As Nature Made Him: The Boy Who Was Raised a Girl." This is an example of intersex and child abuse, if I'm perfectly honest. He was born Bruce in 1965, a healthy male with an identical twin brother, Brian. He endured a botched circumcision that left him without a penis. So I hope that guy got fired, whoever it was. His parents didn't know what to do, because now you have a boy without a penis. So unfortunately, they went to John Money in Johns Hopkins University. And together with Money, the Reimers decided it would be easiest to raise Bruce as a girl, name him Brenda, and to keep the past a secret from the child. At age 14, somehow she learned the truth and immediately reverted to living as a boy, which he had always felt. He changed his name from David, or changed his name from Bruce to David, eventually getting married, became a father of 3 stepchildren, and unfortunately at 38 in 2004, he committed suicide with a shotgun. His childhood was troubled, to say the least. He made annual visits to Baltimore to see Dr. Money. And here we have this nature-nurture debate arising. Under Money's supervision, Brenda had plastic surgery to construct a vulva. Money was adamant that the parents could raise a child to be whatever gender the parents wanted. Gender is a choice. And so if they just didn't tell him that he was born a male, he could eventually grow to become a woman. Obviously, this theory was refuted by the tragic unfolding events. Early in the 1990s, another doctor, Milton Diamond, who was a vehement opponent of Dr. Money, decided that he wanted to engage in the Reimer case. And he spoke with Reimer because he believed that it is not nurture that makes a child what they are. It is nature that is responsible for forming gender identities. And so I think, again, it's an anecdotal thing, so we can't just mic drop this, but Diamond was right. Prior to David's suicide in 2004, his twin brother Brian overdosed on antidepressants in 2002. And unfortunately, this case is often cited by transgenders activists as an example of someone having an innate sense of gender, even though their biology was different. So he always knew he was a boy, even though he had a vulva. But unfortunately, he was born a boy, made a woman, so he was always a boy. So the argument actually goes against them. Dr. Diamond was proved right. We'll leave it there. Let's take a break for about 15 minutes, and we'll come back and talk about, well, we'll finish talking about understanding transgender arguments and stuff like that, and then get into the biblical theology of gender. One of the difficulties of dealing with this issue is understanding transgender language. As we just mentioned, it was only in the 1960s, 70s that people began to use the word gender to refer to something other than the person's biological sex. In the 1970s and beyond, psychologists consistently started to separate the meaning of those terms. And as a result of that, we have a whole host of new terminology that has been associated with that movement. So many of the terms that are used are fluid, no pun intended once again, and some of them are contested. So a word can, like all things in language, a word can mean one thing, and then a few years, months, days later can mean something else. So what I want to do is just, I've included this glossary of transgender terms. You just want to flip to the back there. I just want to highlight a couple of them. I've already used several of them, but just a few of them that are kind of part of the social imaginary a little bit more. So if you look at page 57, the first page, the word binary, again, it's a term for people who associated with typical male or female behaviors. The opposite of non-binary is typical gender queer. We'll get to that one a little bit later. Again, this glossary of terms is, if you notice the footnote, Gospel Coalition there, that website has a number of terms. It's about 5 years old, so I added 12, 13, 14 terms in there from other sources and definitions of my own just to kind of fill it in. Cisgender, you've heard that one. It's a term used to refer to people who have a match between their gender and assigned at birth and their bodies and their personal identities. Generally speaking, used to refer to people who are not transgender. If you go down to one of the things I just realized this morning, stupid me, I didn't have a definition of gender on there. Gender binary is there, the notion that there are only two sexes and two genders. Gender basically, if we want to go with kind of like the American Psychiatry Association definition, it kind of refers to the sum total of attitudes and feelings and behaviors that typically characterize by our culture, by our society, your biological sex. So it can, boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls, and boys dress in blue and girls dress in pink, and those kinds of things. So it's attitudes, it's feelings, it's behaviors that come out of an association by our culture of biological sex. Here are some important terms that we need to understand for our discussion going forward. Gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the feeling that one's gender does not match the sex that was assigned at birth, leaving the person unhappy with their assigned sex, and usually, but not, well, in case of gender dysphoria, usually his or her body. Transsexual people often suffer from gender dysphoria unless or until they transition, and sometimes even afterwards. We'll talk about this. The term gender dysphoria has replaced gender identity disorder, in the 5th version of the DSM manual. So gender expression then is the external representation of your gender identity. So if you look down, gender identity is the term used to refer to an individual's personal sense of identity as masculine or feminine, and your gender expression is representative of your identity. Okay? So gender dysphoria is a psychological condition recognized by the APA, the American Psychiatry Association. Gender identity is how you feel about yourself, which may be as a result of gender dysphoria or other reasons. And then gender expression is how you present yourself. Okay, we'll get into that when we talk about the gender unicorn. Gender fluid is a term for people who prefer to be flexible about their gender identity. They may fluctuate between genders or express multiple gender identities, right? So they can be a woman 1 minute, a man 1 minute, a third sex the next day. So, you can show up today as a man, show up tomorrow as a woman, and we'll just call you gender fluid and have a conversation. Gender queer is an umbrella term for gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or feminine. So sometimes it can be referred to as non-binary or gender expansive, pangender, polygender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so those are important terms. And then on the next page, page 60 and 61, sex. Again, we've sort of explained that. It was previously used to distinguish between the physical identification assigned at birth, male, female, or something else. It's now used by LGBT groups and their allies as synonymous with a self-chosen gender identity. So it's different but the same. And then over on the next page, trans man is a transgender person who is born a female but is now claiming the gender identity of a man. So when you talk about a trans man, you're talking about a woman that has moved over into maleness to man. And a trans woman is the opposite, a transgender person who was born a male but is now moving the other way. So, language is important. So as in most discussions, it's good to say, what do you mean by that? Can you tell me what you mean by that? You're talking about this, what do you mean by that? Because as Inigo Montoya says, we don't always use the same terminology in the same way. And again, be careful with definitions. When you're finding meanings for them, they're fluid and they can change quite often. So let's ask the question of how one can change genders. How does a transgender person do that? So let's get into the details. So the first question that you need to ask or talk about is, are you born with it? So are you born this way, like Lady Gaga says? And by it, I mean the feeling that one's gender does not match the sex that was assigned to you at birth. So are you born with it? Are you born with the feeling that you don't match your birth, right? Now this can be either gender dysphoria or it could be something less than that. So again, there is a bit of a spectrum involved. So on the one hand, you can say that there is binary, cisgender, like male and female. On the other side, you can say that there's kind of, intersex people who are born with a physical condition. Gender dysphoria is somewhere in between that, depending on its strength. And then there's a whole other category of people, and those that just, for lack of a better way of saying it, people who just choose to identify, but they don't have gender dysphoria. And that kind of puts them along the line. So are you born with that? Which brings up the age-old debate, nature or nurture. What's the reason for it? Where does gender dysphoria come from? Where does this feeling come from? To put it in simple terms, using Doug Murray's analogy of computer, is it a hardware issue or a software issue? Right? Is it hardware or is it software? So some argue that it's nature. Current research regarding genetics and transgenderism reveals quite simply that transgenderism is not an inherited trait like skin color. Instead, current research demonstrates that while genetic variations may serve as contributing factors to the complex identity known as transgenderism, the evidence that transgenderism is caused by genetics is very weak. So here's the difference in terminology between contributing factor and causation in science. Contributing factor means that it is one of many factors that may produce an effect down the road. Causation means that something does produce that effect. Okay? So the best that science can say is that there may be an as of yet undiscovered or some kind of genetic factor that serves as a contributing factor, one of many other things that may somehow may lead to transgenderism. Okay? Douglas Murray says this: where the provable hardware part of trans ends and where the software part begins is one of the most dangerous speculative exercises of all. Nothing to date has shown there is a clear hardware reason why some people want to change from the body of one sex into another. Yet there is still a push to move the issue from software to hardware. This has led to a drive to suggest that transgender people are born this way. He's an Englishman, a gay man, and he kind of likens this to the search for the gay gene, which was kind of like in the 90s and 80s, right? Search for the gay gene, which has never happened. There is no gay gene, right? And so he says, I'm gay, and I don't know why. I just am, right? Don't make it a hardware issue, right, if it's not a hardware issue. And the same thing applies here to transgender. There are a couple of theories. However, one of them is a brain sex theory. Simply put, there's the claim that the development and anatomy of the brains of a person who is transgender is different from that who is not transgender. But there are a few studies on this, and almost all of them have been completely debunked. Or they're so narrow in their scope that they have no predictive applicability, right? So in science, if your scope is too narrow, you cannot draw long-term conclusions from it. Then there's another one that is relates to prenatal hormone theories. So what happens, particularly in males, between 8 and 24 weeks in utero is they are exposed to prenatal androgens, sex hormones, which is going to then bring about their biological sex and then later on secondary sex characteristics. And so there's a theory that either less or more exposure to those kinds of hormones, whether it be androgens or something else, can potentially create problems later on. But hey, too little research has been done, and again, contributing factor versus causation leads us to say we're not born this way. Nature isn't an issue. What about nurture? Environmental factors are also posited a case of gender dysphoria. For example, some argue that the rigid expectations of what it means to be masculine and feminine create narrow cultural norms that impose restrictions and constraints on those who do not conform, and that creates a place of oppression for transgender people. So thus, for example, Nicholas Tyke in his book Transgender 101, a transgender man writing this book, says, listen, you need to create a space for your children in particular where they're free to express their feelings about gender in whatever way possible, because if they are nurtured one way and they are not that way, that's child abuse. So be careful not to nurture your child by dressing a boy in blue and girls in pink if they are not boys and not girls. That choice has to be made by them. And so the idea that you can nurture this is potentially an abusive situation. But despite the claims made by various persons and groups, none of these theories, nature or nurture, has sufficient evidence to lend any certainty with it. We simply do not know what causes gender dysphoria or people to choose various gender identities. There's no explanation for gender dysphoria, that being the clinical definition of some. No one has discovered a transgender gene or transgender brain or anything like that. What has been found are some variables that correlate with a higher incidence of transgenders in certain cases. But no biological or genetic trait has been found that is both necessary and sufficient to cause transgenderism. Transgender is not a trait like skin or hair color, and it's farcical to claim that people are predetermined from birth to be transgender. Just no, but again, remember the quote from Dr. Cerrone? The flip, hey, biology is on a spectrum, there's bell curves all over, so there must be when it comes to gender identity, right? If all of biology is like this, well, then it must be over here as well, right? That is, again, that's a leap that is not justified. It's a non sequitur. It doesn't make any sense. So those things cannot pass. Let's talk about the psychology of transgender. Gender dysphoria is listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a manual published by the American Psychiatric Association to diagnose mental conditions. In the DSM-4, gender identity disorder was the name for this condition. In 2013, DSM-5 came out, and gender dysphoria replaced gender identity disorder. Notice the term and language. It's no longer a disorder. It is now something else. So gender dysphoria is a diagnosis given to individuals who are experiencing discomfort or distress due to the difference that they feel between their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth, or their sex-related physical characteristics. And without this diagnosis, most medical professionals will not pursue further steps of gender transition. So how do you diagnose this? How is it typically diagnosed? Well, there's guidelines that the APA provides for both adolescents and adults and children. So in adolescents and adults, there has to be a marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and their assigned gender that lasts at least 6 months and is manifested by at least 2 of the following. Okay? A strong desire to be rid of one's primary or secondary sex characteristics. Your primary sex characteristics is your hardware, right? If you're a man, it's your penis and your testicles and your scrotum. If it's a woman, it's your vagina and your breasts. Your secondary sex characteristics are anything else that doesn't involve reproduction. Okay, so body hair, deepened voice for a man, Adam's apple for a man, whatever. More hair, body odor, stuff like that. Okay, those of you with teenage boys, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So you have a strong desire to be rid of one's primary and or secondary sex characteristics because you experience that incongruence between your expressed gender and your gender at birth. So second thing or third thing, a strong desire for the primary and or secondary characteristics of the other gender. So you don't like your hardware, you want their hardware. A strong desire to be of the other gender. Now again, remember sex and gender are different. So you not only want the other person's hardware, you want what comes with that, right? You want to be a woman, right? You don't want to be a man anymore. A strong desire then to be treated as the other gender. And then lastly, a strong conviction that one has typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. Okay? So in other words, there are some, they're not just going to say, hey, I feel like a woman. Okay, you're a woman, let's go, right? There's certain things that have to take place before that diagnosis comes down, and it has to last for a significant length of time, okay? Again, this is the theory. Let's remember in all of this that this is nowhere mandated. This is what the APA says they recommend, and you can lose your license, all right, as an American psychiatrist if you violate this, but if you're not a psychiatrist, you're a psychologist, or a medical doctor, not a psychiatrist, you can do whatever you want to do. So the DSM-5 defines gender dysphoria in children in the same way, but with significantly more markers. Again, Gender dysphoria is a marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and assigned gender lasting at least 6 months. And this time it has to be manifested by at least 6 of the following. 6 of the following. Okay, same kinds of things. A strong desire to be of the other gender and an insistence that one is the other gender. In boys, a preference for cross-dressing or simulating female attire. In girls, a strong preference for wearing typically masculine clothing and a resistance to wearing feminine clothing. Third, a strong preference for cross-gender roles in make-believe or fantasy. So when they're playing, the girls like to pretend they're boys and vice versa. 4, a strong preference for playmates of the other gender. Boys gravitate to girls, girls gravitate to boys. In boys, a strong rejection of typically masculine toys, games, and activities, and a strong avoidance of rough and tumble play or rough and tumble sports. In girls, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games, activities, sports, etc., etc. A strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy. And then lastly, a strong desire for the physical sex characteristics that match one's experienced gender. So there has to be 6 of those for a child before they will diagnose that child with gender dysphoria. Now, there are questions as how young? How young? Well, therein lies some of the problems we'll get into. Some say as early as 4. Some say 6. Some say, you know what, let's not even go there until puberty has started or puberty is finished for reasons we'll get into a little bit later on. So as with the diagnostics for adolescents and adults, the condition for children is the same thing. There must be distress and or impairment. Okay, there needs to be some sort of, when you lean into the world, when you go out into the world, social, occupational, other important areas of functioning are distressed and impaired because of your gender dysphoria. You're a man, you feel like a woman, and when you live in the world, there's distress and impairment. It causes you massive psychological pain, and it impairs your ability to lean into the world. Again, expressive individualism. It doesn't allow me to actualize myself in the way that I want to, and as a result of that, I don't feel good. So note the treatment statement, okay? Support for people with gender dysphoria may include, this is especially true for children, open-ended exploration of their feelings and experience of gender identity and expression. Notice this phrase. This is where things become troublesome for parents. Without the therapist having any predefined gender identity or expression outcome defined as preferable to another one. And if you violate that, you are subject to litigation in both Canada, not just litigation, criminal charges in both Canada and the US, Bill C6. Okay, so the counselor, the psychiatrist, the social worker, what do they call them? The counselor at school, whatever you want to call them, they cannot counsel you to go in one way or another. They have to let you decide for yourself. So psychological attempts to force a transgender person to be cisgender, sometimes referred to as gender conversion therapy, is considered unethical and illegal. Okay, so the first step to moving beyond is a mental health evaluation. The second one, typically related to this, is social transition. Now, I just want to say this though. We have to remember that there are no agreed upon processes for the way in which this happens. Okay? So if you go to the St. Louis Children's Hospital, or if you go to a clinic in California, or you go to one in New York, or you go to one in Florida, they will, generally speaking, have this process as their rule, but they're not legally required to have it. Okay, which has created a lot of problems, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. When is too early to do it with a child? When is it too early to do it with an adult? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are a number of people in the transgender community that even oppose a mental health evaluation because they believe that transgenderism is not a disease, right? And they believe that its inclusion in the DSM-5 presents it not as a disorder, but as a disease. So, for example, the National LGBTQ Task Force says, gender variance is not a psychiatric disease. It is a human variation that in some cases require medical attention. And so by demanding a mental health evaluation, you are saying that this person is a diseased person. They've got a psychological problem in their brain that needs to be fixed. And that is, again, a problem for a lot of LGBT organizations. Now, they'll still say this is a good thing because once you're diagnosed with it, you can get most insurance companies now in the US are going to cover your surgery, right? So get the diagnosis. It's sort of the lesser of two evils in that regard. But again, according to that website, you know, as long as gender variance is characterized by the medical field as a mental condition, transgender people will find their identities invalid by claims that they are mentally ill and therefore not able to speak objectively about their own identities and lived experiences. So you can hear that expressive individualism and the social imaginary that comes with this, right? So how dare you tell me that I'm mentally ill because I feel this way? And when you tell me that I'm like that, then I can't lean into the world the way I need to, right? And then the slippery slope arguments come. Well, this is going to allow for discrimination. It's going to allow for child custody cases to go a certain way. It's going to prevent me from being hired. It's going to disqualify me from military service or from foster care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And this is a typical argument. It'll create high suicide rates among transgender people. So we can't look at it as a disease framework. So being trans, okay, this is a professor of anthropology at George Washington University in a New York Times article, says, being trans should be a personal or social identity, not a psychiatric one. In other words, if I want to lop off my twig and berries and have it replaced with a vagina, I can do that. And I shouldn't have to be evaluated for my decision. I can do whatever I want. That's what he's saying. It's not a disease. It is my personal choice. He believes this. He believes the label gender dysphoria puts the responsibility on trans people for their suffering and not on the social and moral environment that stigmatizes them. Our sexual lives, he says, and identities are determined not by our genes, but by our cultures. There's that argument again, right? So our culture tells me that I have to act a certain way and be a certain way, and if I'm not that way, it rejects me. That's a cultural problem, not a genetic one. Now, the WHO, that wonderful World Health Organization, which screws up far more than it solves, it seems, in their ICD-11, their International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, published just recently, I think in January of 2022, they've already moved in that direction, okay? They have taken the gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, and moved it out of mental health category and moved it into the sexual health conditions. Okay? So sexual health is, by WHO definition, when viewed affirmatively, requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. So transgenderism is part of that, part of the sexual health, not the mental disorder section, which they define as this: characterized by a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior. So, in other words, the rationale is that it's not a mental disorder, it is just simply the way people engage in sex. And transgender people need to have just as much positive and respectful ability to have their sexual fulfillment as anybody else does. So the WHO has moved that direction. wouldn't shock me at all if at some point the DSM would do the same, where they would just simply say, hey, it's a sexual health issue, you know, be straight, be gay, be bi, be trans. It's your choice. You do what you want. You don't have to come and see us. Okay? Social transition, as I mentioned, is the next one. That means presenting in public or full-time as your identified gender. Typically, as we heard in the DSM, that is the way that dysphoria is diagnosed. And then you have hormone therapy. Hormone therapy is started, which controls secondary sexual characteristics. Women, when they make the transition to men, take male hormones or androgens. This gives them the appearance of masculinity. Their voice is deepened, their muscles and their strength increases. It boosts the growth of body hair, face, arms, legs, everywhere else. And it enlarges the clitoris as well. We'll come back to that. Never thought I'd say that word from up here. Female hormones taken by men, obviously, do the reverse. It helps them to appear more feminine. It decreases their muscle mass. It redistributes body fat. It increases breast tissue, causes them to grow breasts. It thins and slows the growth of hair, body, facial, sometimes even hair on your head. It obviously lowers the testosterone level. Some of these changes can begin in as little as a month, though typically it takes years, 2, 3, maybe up to 5 for maximum effect. For example, men transitioning to women can expect A-cup breasts and occasionally larger ones, but it's going to take about 2 years to get there, which is why a lot of men opt for breast augmentation surgery. Hormone therapy does a lot more than alter your appearance. It can do a couple of things. One, in those who have gender dysphoria, it can dramatically ease those feelings, but it does other things as well. It makes women more aggressive. It makes men more weepy. So women have a tendency to be more aggressive, get angry, more mood swings, and which we'll leave that one alone. Men, same thing. They get less angry, less aggressive, and they get more mood swings than they would have had as a man. But hormone therapy can also have a lot of other potential risks. High blood pressure, weight gain, sleep problems, elevated liver enzymes, heart disease, obviously infertility, tumors of the pituitary gland, blood clots, and many, many other serious conditions. Not to mention psychological stuff going on as well, right? Men cry more easily, women become angry, et cetera, et cetera. Now, most people opt for just hormone therapy. And if they do pursue surgery, not all the way. Okay, so approximately 75% of people who transition to a different gender never produce surgery. Lots of reason for that, potentially cost, pain, problems, difficulty, aesthetics, etc. The estimate is that 1 woman for every 15 men pursue surgery, and the reasons for that are I think, fairly clear, fairly pragmatic, actually. The surgeries for a woman to go to a man are less cosmetically, aesthetically pleasing, and they're less functional than if a man goes to a woman. It's costly, it's painful, and it's irreversible. Most surgeons recommend people spend at least 12 months on hormone therapy before they even consider getting genital reassignment surgery. And there are a few different ways of doing this. So for a man, they obviously will grow breasts due to hormones. And if they're unsatisfied with the progress or the size, they can go and get breast augmentation surgery, which will help them. They also get what's called a vaginoplasty, which essentially means you remove the testicles, you remove the meat out of the penis. I'm not a medical doctor, so I'll just use non-medical terms. You drill a hole or you make a hole in your perineum, somewhere in the middle between your pubic bone area, your bladder, and your anus. and then you take the penis and the scrotum and you tuck it in. And then you take the scrotum, whatever is left, and you can make a clitoris that looks like one, a labia. You can make it into a vagina, hence vaginoplasty. Now, generally speaking, that type of surgery is a lot less problematic, painful, difficult, etc., than it is for the woman to move to a man. What they do in that situation is just simply take the urethra that goes out of the penis, they just tuck it back in, make it come out the vagina, and you can pee. So for that newly constructed vagina, you can have sex with it, you can pee from it, etc., etc. Okay? Now for the female going to male, bigger problems, which is why most females going to male simply have what's called top surgery. They have a mastectomy. And as you saw with Caitlyn Jenner, then she stands bulldogging it, right? Tucking everything in behind. Okay? Because it's very difficult. So there's two options for females. You can have what's called a metoidioplasty. I'm probably not saying that right. So what happens when a female would take male hormone, the clitoris enlarges. And so essentially what is done then is you make a penis out of that enlarged clitoris. And it essentially becomes a micro penis. Like it's not very big. But it's functional because, again, you can take the urethra, you can move that bladder into that penis, and then you can pee standing up. Okay? The second type of surgery is called a phalloplasty. That is a more involved surgery. That's where you take the penis, the scrotum, extra tissue from, where you're making a penis and scrotum using extra tissue. You're taking fat from other places, you're taking skin from other places, and you're actually making a vestigial penis. You're making it so you can have a longer penis. Now that is a much more difficult surgery, much less success in that one, much more painful, much more difficult. But again, you can put the urethra in there and you can make it functioning in that regard. And then you can make a scrotal sac and you can put some fake testicles in there and you can have the whole thing. And like I said, what I've just described based on the looks in your faces, right? That's not something you'd want to do, which is why 70% of people don't do that, right? Again, top surgery is usually where most people go because that's the most visible, right, for people to identify you, and it is the least painful, least expensive, least recovery. Okay? Now, we have to make a note here, just a brief one on disorders of sexual development, or DSD. There are lots of people who suffer from DSD, often referred to as intersex. It's perfectly easy to recognize biologically that there are people born with intersex conditions. They're hardware problems. We can tell that this person has this, and the second shouldn't be there. But we mention this because that's often used, as I mentioned earlier, as an argument for transgenderism. However, it's exceptionally hard, and we have very few means of knowing how to navigate, first of all, what do you do with intersex people? And second of all, is that, how is that proof of transgender, right? Just because there is a biological variation known as a disorder of sexual development, that doesn't demonstrate that, now it's a spectrum, because there's something wrong, to use colloquial language, with those people. So, how many transgender people are out there? Well, that's a problematic question because the rates change all the time. We need to differentiate between clinical estimates, polls, or sociological studies. Psychological, medical, biological, sociological, legal, and even political perspectives and numbers have been offered in the discussion of gender dysphoria. So you always have to pay attention to who's doing it and how many people are involved and how long the study was. Estimates of prevalence are fraught with uncertainty because these concepts are so recent, their meanings are changing, the categories are always moving, and so we've got a potential for things to be massively messed up. So estimates of those who identify as transgender range from 0.03% and 0.03% 0.047% of the U.S. population. The Williams Institute at UCLA in 2016 estimated that 0.58% of Americans identify as transgender. That's an important point, to identify. Not have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, but who identify as transgender. That could include anybody who doesn't think that they're cisgender. So be careful. The number of adults clinically diagnosed with gender dysphoria is markedly lower because the criteria for that diagnosis is stricter. According to one estimate, fewer than 1 in 10,000 adult males and 1 in 30,000 adult females suffer from gender dysphoria of any kind. So there was a Gallup poll done in the U.S. in 2021. The results are based on aggregated data encompassing interviews with more than 12,000 U.S. adults. So that tells you the limit of this study. Okay? The percentage of U.S. adults then extrapolated from that, because that's what it is. It's an extrapolation based upon statistical analysis. The percentage of U.S. adults who self-identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or something other than heterosexual has increased to a new high of 7.1%, which is double that of 2012. So if you're looking at numbers, for example, do I have it out here? No. So if you're looking at this Gallup poll statistics, Gen Z, born 1997 to 2002, 20.8% identify as LGBT, and 75% as straight and heterosexual, and then the other percentage is no opinion. Shockingly, those born before 1946, 0.8 LGBT, 92.2% heterosexual straight, and the other one either didn't give an opinion or don't have one. And basically, between those born before 1946 and those born after 1997, the percentages go 20%, then 10, then 4, then 2, then 0.8. So the older you are, the less likely you are to be transgender or gay or bi. And what's interesting, I have to quote this because Bill Maher is funny. He remarked to this study, he says, if we follow this trajectory, we will all be gay by 2054. But then he makes a serious point. He says, when things change this much, this fast, people are allowed to ask, what's up with that? He goes on to say that we need to be asking questions about transgender stuff because it's very new and it involves children. He says, the answer cannot always be that when a person from a marginalized community is automatically right, end of discussion. Now, when an atheist liberal has issues with gender like this, you know there's a problem in our society. Right? Bill Maher is no friend of Christianity. He's no friend of Christian morality. But he is bang on right on a lot of things. All right, so if we want to extend this to other studies, the Williams Institute study was a study that took place basically from 2014 to 2019. And again, it is an extrapolating study. It estimates, based on previous studies, how many people are currently such and such. Okay? So in this study, they came to the conclusion that 1.3 million adults and 300,000 youth are identified as transgender, youth being 13-ish, 13 to 16. And one of the interesting things that they noted is that geography seems to play a role in this. So just as an example, 3% of youth in New York State identify as transgender compared to 0.6% in Wyoming. Again, Bill Maher, because it's funny. If this spike in trans children is all biological, why is it regional? Either Ohio is shaming them or California is creating them. And that speaks to this. The danger of public space and transgender. The media is relentless in its portrayal and affirmation of transgender ideology. Look at television shows. Look at all Orange is the New Black, Drag Race, America's Next Top Model, Dancing with the Stars, Glee, Umbrella Academy. In fact, I think it was even during the Super Bowl, I saw a Dove commercial
for mothers. No, it was on Mother's Day. Why would I think Super Bowl? On Mother's Day, a Dove commercial for mothers, and it had a transgender man on there, and he made some comment about motherhood and I'm a mother and all the rest, right? Not to mention TikTok and YouTube and all the like, they're populated with transgenders. One of the most popular makeup tutorial gurus on the web is a man named Jeffree Star. 7.4 million subscribers to his YouTube channel. And that doesn't even include people like Gigi Gorgeous and Jazz Jennings, and the laundry list goes on, right? They're everywhere. Health and social service workers, as well as teachers, and may tell parents that their child is consistent, insistent, and persistent about their transgender identity. They should affirm it and support it. And then later on, we'll talk about other stuff. The American Medical Association, the Pediatric Endocrine Society have made statements affirming gender transition, even though there's very little research that has been done concerning the long-term effects of medical practice, such as hormone treatments, sex reassignment surgeries, in particular puberty blockers. In other words, the evidence on the long-term physical and mental consequences of these treatments is significantly lacking. And yet the public pressure to move in that way is massive. Kids are encouraged to explore their gender using cute characters like the gender unicorn. My favorite one, I didn't put it up there because it's so cheesy, is the genderbread person. Same kind of idea, the genderbread person or the gender elephant. But notice here what you've got, okay? So down there in the little nether regions of the guy or girl or something else, which has violated all transgender norms, you've got this, I screwed up, Bob. You can see there sex assigned at birth, male, female, or other intersex. So that's there. But that doesn't define who you are, okay? What defines who you are is all these other things. So your heart, there's a differentiation. You could be physically attracted to a woman, a man, or other genders. And you have to marry that with who you're emotionally attracted to. So you might have to use kind of a transgender-ish country, you might have a sexual kink for males, but be emotionally attracted to females. So then you got to sort that out. Imagine that. Then you've got your gender identity, which, notice, it happens in his brain. Who am I? Male, man, boy, female, woman, girl, something else. And then this thing is how you present yourself to the world. Gender expression, how you're going to show yourself to everybody else. And so it's from, notice, transstudent.org/gender, right? Something for children, something for youths. So what do you do as a school counselor when somebody comes to you and they're a tomboy or they're presenting themselves? Well, you show them the gender unicorn. And you explain to them that, hey, what you're feeling is okay, what you're doing is okay. And then you point to all of these different things, and then you get the child to move through in their own way of thinking how it is that they identify or how they feel or what they think about each one of those different particular areas. And it's widely accepted as self-evident that sex and gender are not simply male or female, but rather exist on a continuum. So this kind of thing is a common occurrence. Okay? Not to mention what is in your public library, your school library regarding this kind of stuff, making it normalized. So it's not just about the social stuff, it's about what happens. So in North America, ideas once considered radical have now permeated our social consciousness, whether we like it or not. Just look at, I only know this because my wife's a country music fan. Do you pay attention to stupidity like this, right? Jason Aldean's wife, Jason Aldean's a country singer. She did like a makeup thing, and then she made some comment, thank you for not, I'm so glad I'm a girl, essentially what she said, right? I went through a tomboy phase, and now I'm a girl, and I can do all this makeup, and right? And then Maren Morris, you're transphobic. It's like, no, you're stupid. Like, why are you making this an issue? Like, she's thankful she's a girl. That's not transphobic. And yet, now we have massive debates. Jason Aldean's wife, what's her name, babe? Brittany? Brittany is now, she's all of a sudden a Tucker Carlson, and Maren Morris is over here. It's like, well, first of all, Elon Musk should buy Twitter and eliminate it from the world. It is a cesspool of evil garbage, right? Most of it, anyway. But that's the world we live in, where even just the I'm glad I'm a girl is just met with transphobia, right? So that's where we are. These ideas that 50, 60 years ago were considered radical extreme are now permeating our social imaginary. They're permeating our social consciousness. And we need to realize that it's a result of complex factors. There's no one solution to this. This is a difficult thing. And at times, I think this is a battle we're not going to win. We can insulate, we can help, but we are definitely not going to win it because the world is evil. And it always has been and always will be. Okay? So we have to sort of set our sights in the right spots. These are worldview issues, not merely scientific, medical, or empirical matters, right? And so we need to be very aware that we're not going to just solve this problem. They're worldview issues, and that creates all sorts of complex stuff. And we have to recognize that we are going to be hated. Hate. That's H stands for hate. We're going to be hated. Hated by our culture. And they even devour their own. So, for example, Dr. Kenneth Zucker was a widely respected psychiatrist, expert in gender dysphoria, who worked at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto. In 2015, he was fired from his job. Why? Because based on the empirical evidence, he continued to advocate a watchful, waiting approach to young people rather than a gender affirmative approach. In other words, he would question the desire or the identity before he would diagnose and progress with treatment. And for that, he was fired. And this happens among themselves. What do you think is going to happen when we as Christians stand up and say, I got some problems, right? The problem at present, as Doug Murray outlines, is not the disparity, but the certainty, the spurious certainty with which an unbelievably unclear issue is presented as though it was the clearest and best understood thing imaginable. How do you clear up something like that? In the face of these rapid cultural realities, the church can't look the other way. Persons experiencing either gender dysphoria or DSD are not them, but us. Although the prevalence is relatively low, we must be just as prepared and ready to receive our brothers and sisters in Christ struggling with gender identity issues as with any other disorder, no matter what the numbers are. Yet, we must recognize that there is a distinctively Christian way to interact. These things are not the way they're supposed to be. Our understanding of and response to these disorders ought to be shaped by the two greatest commandments that were given. Love God above all things, and love our neighbors as ourselves. Thus, in the next section, we're going to turn to Scripture to figure out what it actually says. So, now we're in session 2, which should have started half an hour ago. But I think a lot of this stuff is relatively familiar, so we don't have to go through it too much. We're going to go through a few biblical texts. Central to the discussion of sex and gender identity is the distinction between sex and gender, yet this is a relatively recent one, and it's, to be perfectly frank, it's unknown in the Bible, and it is still highly questionable scientifically, biologically. Ultimately, though, the transgender question, as we have seen, is more than just about sex, about biology. It's about what it means to be human. Are we merely machines, as naturalism would suggest, or are we creatures? This seems to be the question at the heart of the transgender controversy. Are we created, as the Old Testament and as Jesus put it, male and female from the beginning, or are these categories arbitrary and self-willed? Do our bodies and our sexes represent something of who we were designed to be and thus impose limits on our ability to recreate ourselves? Or can we tell our nature and creation what we are? Who's the Lord of our bodies? The question is whether the is of our mental, emotional, The question is whether the is of our emotional or mental state equals the ought of God's design. I am this. This is who I am. Is that decided by me or is that decided by God? Now, the Bible doesn't have anything to say about transgenders. It doesn't tell us transgender is blank. But what it does do is it offers us a blueprint for sex, gender, and for biology. And so we have to explore that as the foundation of our worldview. So we recognize that God created humanity as male and female in the image of God and declared that creation very good. Due to human disobedience, humanity, along with the rest of creation, is now distorted by sin. Thus, whatever we observe about humans after that time is lesser than what we were supposed to be. The fall into sin distorted everything. But there's hope. Salvation in Jesus Christ entails restoration of all things, including humans, to God's creational intentions. In this life, we experience that restoration only in part, while awaiting full restoration at the second coming of Christ. So, let's go all the way back to the beginning. This is the example that Jesus himself used when he was questioned about a number of things. Divorce, for example, he goes back to creation. When Paul is dealing with male-female relationships in the church, he goes back to creation. Creation is a massively important thing. And it's important for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is that Jesus doesn't appeal to current tradition in his answer, okay? So that's very important for us as Christians. We cannot say, well, you know what, as Christians, we act this way as male and female, so that's the way it has to be. It's like, no, we act the way we do based on Scripture. So Jesus doesn't say, well, the traditional way of life in first century Judaism is for males and females to be like this. He says, no, actually, we go back. The kingdom ethic is based on creation. The kingdom ethic is based upon the way God intended for it to be, not based upon what we're doing now, because that might actually be wrong. It's what things were. So central to this is the image of God. Verse 27 of chapter 1. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, some have argued, transgender advocates will argue that in Genesis 1, what we have is pairs in this chapter. Male, female, light, dark, etc., and that this creates the extremes within which there is a spectrum. So one transgender exegete, and I apologize to all legitimate exegetes for using that word to describe this person, says that between the light and the dark is dawn, dusk, right? There's all sorts of gradients of light and darkness in between. So Genesis 1 and 2 clearly, quote unquote, describes that there are boundaries to creation, but between those boundaries there are all sorts of sliding spectrums. Now, I think it goes without saying that that is a brutalization of that text, and it completely misses what our author is trying to communicate. Not the least of which when applied to male and female. Okay, humanity's creation, male and female, is poetically and deliberately highlighted, and it's inextricably linked with our creation in God's image. So we are created in God's image. How? Not just as male, not just as female, but as male and female, and just male as female. This designation is informative of the next verse, verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Humans are blessed with fertility, instructed to multiply, fill and subdue. We are created in the image of God for the purpose of ruling the earth as male and female. And it's clear in this text that male and female refer to biological sexuality, not merely to gender identity or how I feel about myself. Now, the distinction between sex and gender is alien to this text, so we don't want to bring it in there, right? What is our author talking about? Is he talking about gender? Is he talking about sex? No, he's talking about Adam being a man because he has a penis and a scrotum, and Eve being a woman because she has a vagina and breasts. That's how he would have understood it. The issue of gender roles and gender identity, and that's irrelevant. No gender expression because they were naked. Okay? But in itself, that is the central point. Male is to possess male sexuality, and female is to possess female sexuality, and to exercise one or the other through procreation is essential to fulfilling God's creation mandate. So to be male and female not just means who I am by myself, but it's who I am by myself so that I can be joined with my wife and produce children. So that extension is maleness and femaleness. So human sexuality receives even more attention in Genesis 2 than it does in Genesis 1. So in Genesis 2, we have this extended story where God creates a human being, Adam, a man. And it's good, right? But it's not good that he's alone. He needs somebody else. He needs a helper suited for him, Genesis 2:18. The word helper is not a word of inferiority. It means like opposite. We need to create somebody like Adam, but that's opposite to him. Like opposite, a helper. That can be a complement to him, a like opposite. And so the text emphasizes the similarity of the woman to the man and the difference between them. She's a fellow human, but she is a woman. Adam cannot fulfill the creation mandate on his own. Unlike the animals who were created according to their own kind and at that point could procreate, he needs someone who is sexually like opposite him. Like him as a human, opposite of him as a female. And so God creates the woman. Now, it's interesting that the Hebrew text first uses gendered terms for the man and for the woman. The man is ish, the woman is asha. The very words communicate similarity and difference. And the man exalts the woman. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called Isha, woman. For she was taken out of man, Ish. This exaltation it appears in the context of the man and woman's unabashed sexuality. The text goes out of its way to say something that we did not need. They were both naked and they felt no shame. Now, that'll be significant given chapter 3 for reasons that we'll discuss. But the maleness and the femaleness, they're told, male, female, alike opposite, created for the reason of procreation and subduing the earth. And so they were both naked so they could get on with it. So they could do what God commanded them to do. Make babies, fulfill the creation mandate, and fill the earth. So sexuality is good and right, and when it is done within the context of a male-female relationship, it leads to the exaltation and glory of God. And it's only the fall that has changed that, marred it, abused it, created suffering within it. So this is why a man leaves his father and mother, he's united to his wife, they become one flesh, verse 24. Now, at this point, I want to bring something up. You can think about this yourself and figure out. But I think one of the problems theologically with issues of transgenderism is the issue of image and envy. Specifically, transgenderism, I think, and I'm not going to say this too much because I just kind of threw this in there on Friday kind of as a last-minute thing because I've been thinking about it. Transgenderism is at root sinful envy of the sexual anatomy or identity of another person. Envy, biblically speaking, is an obsession, a driving passion that insatiably drives a person to desire something that another person has. We think of envy with regards to cars and houses and money, etc., but I think it's legitimately applied to this particular issue as well. Matthew Henry states the danger of envying someone when he comments on Proverbs 27, 3 and 4. Those who have no command of their passions sink under their load. So those who envy other people and do not have those passions restrained, it's going to be highly problematic for them. Proverbs 14:30, envy makes the bones rot. In other words, if we don't deal with the sin of envy, it's going to devour us. It's going to eat us from the inside out. A transgender identity, I think, is envious. It makes a mockery of the Word of God, His commands, and of the created order. So, and then further on, I think Romans 1, 28 and 29 talks about unbelievers being given up to a debased mind, a mind that is problematic. And then he said they're filled with all matter of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, and they're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, etc., etc. Envy is one of the issues. So to be full of envy is to be blinded by the desire that God has for me due to the desire that I have for something else. So anyway, just something to think about. The Christian church has always recognized that Genesis 1 and 2 are paradigmatic. The New Testament sees it that way. And I think we need to understand this as being more than just a story about days and length of days. No, it's a story about who we are as human persons. As Kevin Van Hooser writes, one's true self is not therefore hovering above or within one's body. At the limit, the idea that we are men trapped in women's bodies or women trapped in men's bodies collapses the distinction between sex and gender and flirts with Gnostic, even docetic, disregard for bodily reality. Bodies matter. They are a gift from God. And due to the fall, it's all messed up, right? But bodies matter, even after the fall. We're told by Paul that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and therefore it's not our own, right? An important text to remember for Christians. For that reason, in refusing one's biology, the creature refuses what is ultimately not merely a natural given, but a gift of God. Our true vocation is not to reject our physical bodies. It's to discern, deliberate on, and do those possibilities that are given to us with our biological sex. Like other disorders and diseases, these afflictions can be interpreted as a result of the fall. Things are not the way they should be. Creation has been distorted. God's creation was good, but sin came around and messed it all up. Now, this doesn't mean, let's not go to the extreme and say that the people suffering from these conditions are personally responsible for them. Some are. Like I said, some people, I think, not that I'm an expert, obviously, but some people do legitimately have a legitimate mental condition called gender dysphoria. Just like there are mental health disorders that Christians suffer from, like bipolar and, I can't use the word schizophrenia. What's the terminology instead of schizophrenia? Personality, something about personality disorder. Something like that. I don't know what it is. And there are legitimate anxiety and da-da-da-da-da. Like those are legitimate things. And I think gender dysphoria, properly diagnosed, is one of those things. But not everybody who claims to be transgender suffers from that. But even that, as we'll talk about later, is not defining of us. Right? So people do suffer from the consequences of the fall. And we, I think, underestimate that when Paul says creation is groaning. I think we underestimate that. I think, at least I do, I think when I think about the creation groaning, what do I think of? Lightning, thunder, tornadoes, famines. I don't think that my body is groaning. I'm creation. My body is groaning. Right? And the church, therefore, needs to have a stance of compassion and love. We'll get to that a little bit later on. Let's see what time. What time is Iris downstairs? Do we know when time lunch is going to be ready? Tim says another 10 minutes. All right, let's do it. Let's go till noon. Thanks, Tim. Is there anything on there I didn't talk about? No. All right, let's talk about the fall. We've already introduced that a little bit. Genesis 3, we know that Genesis 1 and 2 are not the end of it. The fall of the first man and woman into sin is the first disobedience against the direct command of God. And the initial challenge, did God really say, was followed by a stronger challenge, you will not certainly die. The temptation for Eve is the temptation of expressive individualism. Like, you will be like God. You can become like God. Don't be willing to listen to what God is trying to say to you. Right? In other words, don't be satisfied with a mimetic worldview, that there's structures to the world and that you should fit in those structures. You need a poetic worldview. The world is just simply stuff that you can mold and shape, and when you do that, you can become like God. You won't surely die. You'll know good and evil. And the way to get there is to disobey. And didn't work out that way. I mean, some of that stuff was true. They did know good and evil, unfortunately. But a lot of the other stuff was problematic, to say the least. Their eyes were open, verse 7. And the first thing that they noticed when their eyes were open, they were naked. They were naked. And so what did they do? They run into the bush, they sew fig leaves together, and they made coverings for themselves. Sin immediately turns what was a source of joy and exaltation into a source of shame and fear. Okay? Alienation from God immediately turns into the alienation of man and woman from one another. It breaks down social categories. The vulnerability of nakedness ceases to be a gift and now becomes a threat. Notice Adam's statement. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Right? Now, again, we use our sanctified imaginations. That the implication is that God had long walked in the garden with Adam and Eve while they were buck naked. But now Adam and Eve see their nakedness as something that God cannot see. I got to hide myself not only from my wife, but from my God. I was naked. The shame that comes from that is immeasurable. And as it appears in the narrative, God draws the conclusion that the man has disobeyed his command simply on the fact that he now knows that he's naked. He knows. You wouldn't be covering up yourself if you hadn't have broken my command. Who told you that you were naked, God asks in verse 11. Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? So now we know why in chapter 2 it was emphasized that they were naked and felt no shame. Frolicking and dancing around, buck naked. Because that's going to be the first indication that God's going to notice that something went wrong because they covered themselves. They shouldn't. They shouldn't have. The significance of sexuality, we don't want to overemphasize and make it all about sexuality, permeates the promises and the curses that God begins to declare in verse 14. The enmity that stems from the curse will extend to the offspring of the woman. From this time forward, God-fearing men and women would be self-conscious of the way in which their participation in the bringing forth of children would be central to God's purposes for redemption. And I think it's an understatement to say that sex has been a taboo subject and makes us all giggle since then. You should have seen most of your faces when I said the word vagina. That's a result of the fall. We're embarrassed by it. We don't like to talk about sex, right? We don't even like to think about think about your parents having sex. Oh, see? Foy! My parents only had twice, so I'm fine. I'm okay. I'm okay. But see, that's a result of the fall. Childbearing is affected by it. Severe and painful labor. And to make matters worse, verse 16 says, to the woman, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. The intimate relationship between the husband and wife that was characterized by their cooperative nudity would give way to covering, conflict, and domineering. Sexuality after the fall would be plagued with suffering and conflict, unfulfilled desires, exploitation, and abuse. An oppressive patriarchy would take the place of purposeful marital communion. All because of the fall. This is precisely the picture we get in the rest of the book of Genesis. You don't have to read that far in Genesis to realize how far and how fast humans can fall in their sexuality on account of what happened here. In the lives of the patriarchs, we see polygamy. We see the sexual exploitation of slaves, incest, rape, spousal abuse, adultery, divorce, prostitution, sexual harassment, jealousy, violence stemming from sexual immorality, and a whole host of other areas of conflict. There's nobody in Scripture other than Adam and Eve that offers us a model of God's purpose of sexuality beyond chapter 2 of Genesis. And it's just as it was immoral for the patriarchs to treat women in accord with the fall and sinful convictions of their culture, it's sinful for us as Christians to abandon God's will from creation by acting in terms of our culture. So back to Jesus, when he talks about divorce, when he talks about eunuchs, when he talks about certain situations, he says, listen, this isn't the way it should be. It should be the way it was before the fall. So he doesn't point to tradition. He doesn't teach people rabbinic thought. He says, there was a way that it should be, and you fell from it. So premarital sex, cohabitation, divorce, sexual assault, a host of other sexual practices, including transgenderism and homosexuality and all the rest, that are tolerated by our culture, are symptoms of a fallen world that is under the curse of sin. So Christians are called to flee from all such sexual immorality as we walk not according to the mind of this world, but according to the mind of Christ. All right, we'll take a break there. We'll have lunch. Take a little Matterslope if you need one. We'll be back in an hour. We'll finish up with some other biblical texts that are important, I think. And then we'll get into our response to transgenderism.